Time for more Earth Science. This is Norris Teaches Science with me, Mr. Norris. Another Earth Science video is coming at you, and today I present the water cycle. So hopefully by the end of this video, you should be able to say I can explain how important water in the cycle is for the environment. So let's talk about water on Earth, where it is, what its form is, how much water, basically the distribution of water. So 71% of the earth is water. 97% of the water on earth is in the ocean. That means it is salt water, unusable in most senses for humans. 3% of all water on earth is fresh water, and humans need fresh water to survive. We drink fresh water. But 2% of that fresh water 2% of that water is in ice and glaciers, trapped in a solid form. 0.6% is in underground water, known as groundwater, and 0.4% of water is in rivers, streams, lakes, and in the atmosphere. So that's where all the water is on Earth. Now, water phase changes, these are a couple phase changes you need to know about water. Water has vaporization or evaporation. This is when it goes from its liquid state, liquid, to gas. That's evaporation. Condensation is the reverse, from a gas to a liquid. Melting is when you go from a solid to a liquid, and when you reverse it, that's called freezing. There are other phase changes, as you can see up here, but we're not going to talk about them in this section of the notes. We may get into them a little later on. So the water cycle. So water is constantly moving between different parts of the environment. They move between the oceans, the atmosphere, the solid earth, the biosphere. It's in constant motion. So, parts of the water cycle. This is just a very important slide. I definitely would pause here and write this down. These are some vocabulary words. These are the parts to the water cycle. So, the first part is evaporization. This is when liquid water changes into water vapor. Condensation is when water vapor in the atmosphere is turned to liquids, making the clouds. Then you have precipitation. This is liquid or solid water from the clouds, and it falls. You can have rain, you can have snow, you can have hail. It's many different types of precipitations. We're going to get to a point where we talk about meteorology and weather, and we're going to talk more in depth about precipitation. D says infiltration. This is water that moves through the ground. Its job is try to get to groundwater. We're going to talk about groundwater later on in this video series. You got runoff. This is when water hits the ground, just is not absorbed. It just goes over the surface. I talked about runoff when we talked about erosion and weathering in that sense. But runoff is part of the water cycle. And then there's a thing called transpiration. And this is when water vapor is released to the air by plants. So these are the parts of the water cycle. Well, let's look at the water cycle. Here it is. And so we're going to label it. So the first thing we're going to label is something, if we're going to label evaporization, and that's going to happen here. Evaporization. Bear with me as I write with a mouse. All right, the liquid water is going to turn into gas and go in the atmosphere. When it gets up here, it's going to go through condensation. And not only does it condenses over the water, it's also going to condense over the land. So this over here, where there's clouds, is also condensation. Now, once there's enough water in there, it's going to release that water because it cannot hold anymore. And so right here in the middle, this is precipitation when it rains. So it comes down. When it rains, it can do multiple things. You can have runoff, or you can have over here going into the soil. Best as I could show it is infiltration. The last thing that could happen is transpiration. That's over with the trees. That's when they release water vapor into the atmosphere. So transpiration. Now there's an empty blank here. I wonder if you can figure out what it is. It's the ocean. Water systems lead to the ocean in some way. So this is the water cycle. You may want to pause, sketch it out a little bit. I'll give you a 5-second count to pause it. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, let's move on. What does water balance mean? It means that precipitation amount must equal evaporation amount. That's the goal of the water cycle. If you have more evaporation than you have precipitation, you could have climates form like a desert. But how do we use water? 70% of water we use is in irrigation, where we go and we give it to the land for farming. 20% of water is used in industries, and 10% of water is used in cities and residencies. And so you probably fall into the category of 10%. We're talking about like flushing your toilet, getting a glass of water, cooking, stuff like that. That's where that 10% is. Now, some interesting water facts. There's the same amount of water on Earth now as when Earth formed. Liquid water expands by 9% when it freezes. The average total home water use for each person in the United States is about 50 gallons per day. And ice is less dense than water, which is why it floats on liquid water. And I really hope you learned something today about the water cycle, even if you just learned some new facts about water to impress your friends or family or whoever you want to impress. Maybe someone you're trying to ask out and you want to sound smart. But this is Mr. Norris, and I'm signing out for this video.